Now, up to this point in the class, we've been talking about this very broad topic that we call AF. We've been talking about the fundamental underpinnings of AF, creating elements, creating element templates, etc., etc. And now, actually, we're going to get into something a lot less fundamental. Now we're going to start talking about the substitution parameter. It's probably one of the more obscure things, something you may not use for a while. So it's important stuff, but I wouldn't call it the fundamentals. We've just covered those. So we'll start by taking a look at this option of using the substitution parameter. We use it when we configure library elements like element templates and attribute templates. Substitution parameters work like this. When you're configuring the settings for these attribute templates, in some of these fields, instead of specifying hard-coded text, you can specify this substitution text. And the substitution indicator we have is the percent symbol. So by specifying something like this, the percent symbol, and then these reserved words, let's go with element, and also I'll put in a period after that, and then we'll do percent attribute. What this means is, instead of putting the word element attribute, it's simply going to substitute whatever the current element is and the current attribute, such that when when I create a new element attribute that looks like this in the actual elements collection, remember this is the template here, when I actually create this element, it's going to create an element that has a tag reference to a tag that has that name. And that can be very convenient if you end up happening to have Pi tags that have those names. In fact, that's how you can design your system. If your Pi system has names like this or has been configured with names like this, then when you create these AF elements and the attributes that are pointing to data references in Pi, it'll automatically find those tags. Let me give you an example. Now that's the default we're looking at right here, this element attribute. You'll see that if you choose to create a PyPoint data reference without entering a tag name. I'm just going to let's just use the word element here, and I'll just demonstrate how this works. So this means at runtime, when I create this, an element based on this template, it's going to have a reference to a tag that is the same name as the element. Now this is not going to affect any of our existing tags or any of our existing elements. The existing elements are going to be left alone by this. I'll go ahead and check this in. And this is the mixing tank template. So let me go ahead and exploit what I just created. I'm going to go into my elements collection here, and I think I'll just go under the equipment maintenance section here, and I'm going to add a new mixing tank. So underneath here, I'll do a new child element. That child element will be built on that mixing tank template. And once I create that, let me give it a good name here. Let's take a look at what attribute got created here. So it's called mixing tank 3. Here's that attribute whose configuration I just modified. And as you can see, it's if we take a look at its settings, you can see it's specifying that it needs to retrieve an element based on that name. Well, right now the name is called Mixing Tank 3, and so it's looking for a tag called Mixing Tank 3, and of course it doesn't find one. If I refresh my screen, you'll notice it doesn't find a Pi tag called Mixing Tank 3, and we see this message saying it cannot retrieve it. Watch what happens though if I change this to a tag name that does exist. Oh, for example, I know a tag called CDT158. I'll go ahead and check this in. We take a look at our attributes now. See, now it's actually looking for a tag called CDT158. And when I refresh my screen, because in fact there does exist a tag called CDT158, this substitution has its, oops, wrong attribute. This substitution has its desired effect. It's substituting the name of the element. The name of the element happens to be the name of a tag. So I can create as many of these as I want, and as long as I give them names that are the same as Pi tag names and base them off of this template here, I'll go ahead and create another one. Let's go with, how about BA:conc.1. I know there's a tag, a sample tag that exists like that. Go ahead and check that in. Let's take a look. It's looking right now for BA:conc.1. Let me refresh my screen. And as you can see, that's working just fine. Now that's an example that's rather, kind of a silly example, because it would be very odd for you to create a bunch of tanks that are named after pi tags. I just wanted to demonstrate what's happening. Later on, I'll show you how, in just a few minutes, we'll take a look at how you might use this in a more practical way. Now that substitution identifier, the %, can be used in a variety of places. It can be used when you create a table reference. Let me show you an example. I'm going to take a look at this storage tank. And in this storage tank, you see this production goal daily. It's actually doing a table lookup. It's doing a table lookup in which we're specifying that we would like to have the lookup match this is going to be a column in a table with the current name of the parent element. As you can see, there's our substitution. Let's look at it this way. What we're saying is we've got a table that we're looking up something in. This is actually going to be a production goal for the different production lines. And what we're saying is if the line is equal to the name of the element, the parent element, then bring in one production goal. So for example, production line 1 is going to have one goal, production line 2 will have a second goal. So let me show you what needs to be in place for this to work. Oh, and by the way, as we look at this, watch how it changes. If I change storage tank from production line 1 to production line 2, watch the production goal change. The production line 1 has a daily goal of 45,000. 2 has 62,000 as its goal. Well, how did we do that? We did it through a table reference, so let's take a look at the table. This is a table I created just to demonstrate this example. Here's the table. It's very straightforward. It has two columns, line and goal. We're saying production line 1 has 45,000, production line 2 62,000. And again, if I were to make changes here, let's say we're going to go with 62.5. Okay. When I make those changes, everything that is based off of this, all the table lookups are going to get that update. So let's take a look at the table reference that we're making here. We're going to do this in that the storage tank template. In the storage tank template, I added a brand new attribute called production goal. And that attribute is defined like this. It is a table lookup, and what we're saying is when the line is equal to the name of the parent element, then that's the result we're going to be bringing back. Our result column is going to be the goal. So that's going to be either 45,000 or 62.5. That was what was in that column. This column right here in that table is what we're trying to map to. And if you recall, there were two columns in there. There was the production line 1 and production line 2. So if we now take a look at our elements themselves, the elements themselves, they're, this storage tank right here, its parent element is called production line 1. And so as a result, when we take a look at this production goal, we find that the name of the parent element is production line 1, so we retrieve 45,000. For storage tank 2, which is in production line 2, we retrieve 62,500. And that's what we're doing essentially, is making use of this substitution. Now that's pretty obscure. I don't know when you're going to be making use of that, in your initial rollout, but it could be something that really saves the day. It gives you a mechanism to actually reach into the configuration and then bring out data conditionally based on what your configuration is, based on what your architecture is. So anything that I add under production line 2 is going to come up with that production goal daily of 62.5. So that's an example of using that substitution here. We're using that % element. Now you'll find in your documentation just more information about the different syntax, and you'll also see there's drop downs available for doing this. So when I actually configured this, let me show you. When I actually configured this in my template, this was something I did not have to type in by hand, because if you look at this attribute or value field, when I went to choose the attribute or value, some of the options I had were these different substitutions, and I just chose this one. This is the ... / element. That's going to be the name of the element of the parent attribute.